you may be familiar with. However, there are some other ones out there that sometimes when we're talking to people about projects that are livable in nature get overlooked, and some of those have been the Buy America requirements for federal aid projects as it relates to steel. Another issue that we frequently run into is the use of proprietary materials, which is limited under the federal aid highway laws and regulations. And this has sometimes led to some difficulties with sponsors who have a specific look and feel that they want to have for their particular project. The last thing that I want to emphasize with this slide is that really for a division, we, like the local and state officials, we see success as really meaning a project gets done. Projects can't be just put in the books and put in a transportation plan. We really are held accountable by the public to, is it open? Can I really use that? Later on at the end of this presentation, I've actually added a couple pictures of some open and the public using some livability projects here in Indianapolis. With that, I did want to discuss or mention to you all that there are a variety of different federal aid highway programs that can support livability. Again, I think our national presentations on livability frequently mention some of these different programs, and it really does look like that there are quite a few programs, and that is absolutely true. However, what's important to understand is that each of these programs may come with different requirements or limits. They also come in different amounts, and those amounts may vary between state to state. For example, I was looking up in preparation for this presentation, we have a surface transportation program listed here. In Illinois, Illinois received about $356 million in 2011 in what we would call STP, but Indiana received $245 million. The second item is what we call CMAQ, or Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Funds. Illinois received $116 million. Indiana received $50 million. Last one I wanted to mention was Safe Routes to School. That's $9 million in Illinois and $4 million respectively in Indiana. So I'm just mentioning that these are some very different programs. I would also mention that they all have people who are already applying for these funds, and so in many cases the metropolitan areas and the states have a pipeline of projects already identified to use some of this money. So it can be a little difficult to compete for the dollars. One other item I wanted to mention here, I highlighted or put an asterisk next to safety loop programs to emphasize that these projects have actually are running on what we call a continuing resolution. The Safety Lou Act actually expired in 2009. Congress is currently discussing new legislation, and some of these programs, the discussion right now is that they may be combined into fewer programs, but the funding amounts are unclear. And so these dollar amounts that I mentioned to you may be subject to change depending upon what Congress and the President ultimately approve. Again, just wanted to mention as a division office, our responsibility is to really promote the elements of livability in projects, but it's up to the states and local partners to make the final decisions as to how to incorporate those into their projects. We do find ourselves at times in situations where someone wants something that is proprietary, and as I mentioned, that can run us into an issue of compliance. In addition, financial accountability. We've had some project sponsors who've said, well, you've selected me and now I would like to receive my check for the dollar amounts of my grants, and the Federal Aid Highway Program operates on a reimbursement basis. So financial accountability is built into our system, and one of the things that we as divisions do is, the last bullet here, we help to manage expectations. We have frequently started to go out in advance of projects being selected to help MPOs and project sponsors all really understand before they get selected what are the requirements that they may face as they go ahead and deliver their projects here in Indiana. What that has really done from my standpoint, it has really helped us to be more on the customer service side of things. It's certainly much easier to help people to know before it's a requirement what they need to be preparing rather than waiting till they're ready to go or ready to make a purchase, and we have to tell them, I'm sorry, that's not allowed. So manage expectations. As far as Indiana goes, in Indiana, livability has at times been a bit frustrating. That's because amongst those 6 principles that I showed you earlier, They are not going to provide any additional dollars. The states in the metropolitan areas have realized this isn't new money, but it is an emphasis on what is allowed under the existing resources available. In addition, new project sponsors have sometimes come in with an expectation that if they qualify for one of those principles, that they may be automatically approved for funding. That's actually not correct. And so it's really important for anyone who's interested in having a project that meets some of these livability principles to talk with your state partners or talk to your metropolitan partners in advance. That way that you can have a better understanding of not only what are their requirements to be selected, but you also will probably get a better feel for how many other projects are already vying or competing for the resources that they have. One of the things that, like I mentioned, brings up is, well, what's the most important principle, or is one principle more important than another? We've seen that come up when people have said, is the natural environment more important or less important than the human environment? In some of our metropolitan areas, I believe Northwest Indiana may be a good case. You have some very highly urbanized areas up in the northwest area of the 3-county area, but then in Porter or LaPorte County, which are also considered part of the metropolitan area, they're a little more rural than you would find, say, in East Chicago or Merrillville or places such as that, or Gary. So there's some expectations as to what is livability and what is most important for that region. And then I think the last bullet here is really important too, is as we've opened the door to livability and helped bring in new people in, a lot of new stakeholders have asked that question, well, who really makes the decision, and how do I make sure that my voice is heard? And again, I would emphasize this is where it's very important for you to get to know your state partners as well as your metropolitan organizations. In Indiana, Northwest Indiana is represented by the Northwest Indiana Regional Planning Commission, and also from the Indiana State DOT standpoint, they have a LaPorte District Office. They are to be working together as they identify and select projects together for that 3-county area. For Indiana, we're kind of a very pragmatic state. One of the things is that we don't really get as much resources as perhaps that we could use, and the MPOs and the locals in the state are always asking us, tell us something that is really pragmatic that we can do. And so when we started to look at livability and mention it, one of the first things that we ran into was that we needed to kind of get a catalog or an inventory of what's really out there. There are so many different stakeholders who are very interested in getting to have their project funded that we really decided that the best step was to have metropolitan organizations learn to do what is called the red flag analysis. This is an analysis that has traditionally done later after a project is selected during NEPA. I believe that it's been better received as we've looked at those environmental resources before projects have been selected. It, however, then is also something that can be handed on to the NEPA professionals once the project has been selected and incorporated into a transportation plan. What this is allowing people to do is to really get a better understanding of some of the other issues and factors before projects are actually prioritized and selected. It also allows people the opportunity from the public to raise their questions and to help identify resources that are significant before decisions are being made. Policy committees at the metropolitan level sometimes are inclined to make decisions, but they do that based upon the information that they have available. This step has been able to equip them to discuss resources and needs perhaps in a little bit different fashion. And it also has required that when it comes to a need that may be not just local, I would emphasize when the state DOT has a need, it's required them to kind of step forward and to provide perhaps some of their own perspective about the need for such things as freight mobility. What does that look like? I've taken this slide to kind of give you a concept of what what we sometimes hear people call it as asset mapping. If you work with geographic information systems, this is just that concept of layers of information from a variety of different sources. The red flag analysis requires that a formal document be prepared and summarized of the potential environmental resources, but that requires all of these different layers of information. you'll notice that there's one layer in there listed as other assets or resources. That's because in this task, a couple things are going on. First, we want to start with the basics of the human and natural environment. The transportation needs need to supplement or integrate with that, but there are assets and resources that we are likely to miss. And what this is trying to demonstrate is you need to ask the open question of what are the assets or resources that we perhaps are not realizing as we're making decisions. I think it also begins to consider the question of how do you make sure that your plans and resources are properly being allocated as well as are financially being maintained. It's a very pragmatic task, but it's also one that we felt that our state partners, our local partners would all be able to understand and work together on. One of the things that we see that is very important when it comes to livability, because livability can be many things to many people, is to get people to work together to solve a problem. It helps people to learn what the other issues may be that they are not familiar with, and ask the question, what do you see that maybe I don't see? If I may use a quick example, we happened to do a workshop with Delta, or be invited to do a workshop with the Delta Institute earlier this year, and a forester in Lake County, Indiana had talked about an elaborate plan or idea of connecting different forested areas within the Northwest Indiana area. However, this was not something that had been mentioned before. I certainly hadn't heard it, and we were very eager to see how that was going to be included in the county's comprehensive plan, so that that resource would be something that as the state and as local communities identify areas that they are either going to zone for different business purposes, or if they're looking at doing transportation improvements, that concept, that plan of the foresters could be taken into consideration. Another example is we have a community, Carmel, Indiana, that is actually very aggressive at putting in roundabouts and providing for pedestrian access. And they have been very good to talk to the state DOT about, as projects are coming on or alongside their community, how are the transportation projects being developed that can accommodate their local pedestrian accommodations as well. So this whole idea of putting a map together and then having everybody take a look at it has been very, very helpful. It's built cooperation, but it's also identified some gaps. One specific gap has been with some safety crash data, where as the state has put out the layer of crash locations, many of the metropolitan organizations have come back and said, we actually looked at the state police reports and we believe your map is in error. It's not, miles off, but it's a few hundred feet off, and that can have a significant impact on some of the decisions that are being made. And so this task of asset management and trying to bring in the whole concept of livability so that we're not just looking at roads, we're not just looking at one feature, has really been helpful for many of us here in Indiana, especially to try to get this whole idea of livability better understood. So some keys to success. Don't wait to get involved until a project is under development. That is actually something that US EPA said at that workshop that we were at earlier this year. And I found it to be very, very appropriate. The state DOT and the metropolitan planning organizations really need to know about what you're wanting to do or what you're intending to do before you come and approach them. Because to be quite candid, they have a lot of projects that are competing for funding right now. And so the more that they know about your project and the more you can be organized and how you present that to them, the better off you are. Also understand that the federal aid highway program today is limited. In many cases, there are already 3 or 4 years worth of projects already in a pipeline. So funding, if available at all, may not come immediately to you. Or if it does, it may be coming at someone else's expense, so to speak. And sometimes communities are a bit reluctant to allow others to come in and compete for their funding. That said, we're finding that many times it's not a brand new project, it's it's augmenting or supplementing a project, or making sure that as you're rehabilitating a roadway, certain features are incorporated into. However, there's always a question of cost, and in addition, in Indiana, there's always a question of where are the matching funds coming from, and who will maintain that project after it is completed. I put this third bullet on there because it really is important to ask you to be prepared to help others understand what your interests are and the resources that are important to different communities can be readily available. This whole asset management concept, there's actually now an Indiana map that online all metropolitan organizations can actually use a common geographic information system type system in order to do their red flag analysis. That said, they're working on the mechanics of when you find something that you may or may not agree with, how do you address that? But it's certainly making our ability to communicate and coordinate much, much better. Other issues to be aware of as we continue to look at how to incorporate livability is, as I mentioned, Safety Lou has expired. Congress is looking at a variety of new transportation bills for funding as well as priorities. You may have heard of a 2-year bill called MAP 21 that was passed out of the Senate, but the House of Representatives has not approved it. There's also been some bills drafted by the House. Each of the bills that we've been able to see just tentatively have all emphasized the use of performance measures. Tentatively, we've seen some on roads and bridges, but we're very curious, and I'm in particular very interested in knowing, well, what types of other performance measures are there to be? That's because, as you all probably are aware, many times what gets measured gets done. And a concern that we have is, how do we make sure that we don't only fund roads and bridges, and we don't only fund, I shouldn't say only fund as much as how do we make sure we're keeping the door open to some of these livability ideas. But the key issue here is that funding is in question. Accountability is going to continue. And in some cases, we've seen some bills which have actually decreased funding anywhere between 10, 15, and even 20%. Now that varies from state to state. But you can imagine if the funding goes down, there are all of these projects that are currently under development, that can create some concerns as to how we proceed. The last thing that I would mention here is, and I have a couple, my example from Indianapolis of a project really helps to emphasize this, but be considerate of what other types of resources may be out there besides just federal dollars. I've mentioned here in the slide itself Louisville Bridges. That's because we are getting ready to advance the Louisville Bridges project using a significant number of different types of resources. We may use tolling, we may have public-private partnership, but the idea is that it's not just federal dollars. And sometimes what we've seen is that you can actually attract some significant local interest in your projects if you're well organized. End this with the time to get involved in a project is before it is selected. The more you can be prepared and be able to present a cohesive and well thought out project plan, I think the better off you are. I also think that many of our projects are converting to use more livability, but the questions are, if you can get that in the scope of the project early on, you're much, much better off. So we'll see how we go as the next reauthorization of the highway bill occurs. With that, I did want to tell you, earlier on I mentioned to you, well, what does success look like in Indiana? While we've talked about livability and what's important to us, I did want to show you that this is what success looks like. What you see here is some photographs from the Indiana Cultural Trail. It's a circular trail that goes quite a bit around the downtown area here in Indianapolis. It incorporates some sustainability issues. You see some plants around some vegetation to help mitigate stormwater runoff. You see some pedestrian traffic. You see some people with a wheelchair as well. As I mentioned earlier, we're working with communities on how to improve Americans with Disabilities Act compliance. We have a transit stop that was actually funded by Transit, and then we have some historic a walkway with some historic items on it. Those were actually one of those proprietary items that we had to work with. But the idea was that we found a way to make it successful. Where did it come from? Well, here's an example of where the funding isn't just federal. While there's a $20 million Tiger grant, almost half of the funding actually came from private funds, and the maintenance of this is all being funded through private dollars. And so a $60-some-odd million project was more than $30 million funded through local investment. What does it look like? Well, this is the Super Bowl in Indianapolis. I felt like this was the best way to demonstrate to you all livability can really do some amazing things. And here is, you see the downtown Super Bowl area prominently displayed. It's just one example of how the city of Indianapolis is taking advantage of its trail. You can see some tents that are up. They have put power that runs along the street so that people can put street awnings up if that's what they would like to do during certain events. But otherwise, it can also be converted back to one lane traffic either way. But it's always open to pedestrian traffic. It's always open to people. And if you come down sometime, go to eat down here. It's really a lot of fun. What it does try to do, though, is show you that we are doing things with livability. And while not all projects may be this grand, it certainly demonstrates that as an example of where the City of Indianapolis worked with the Metropolitan Planning Organization, even worked with the state DOT, and then our division office to look at how we can fund some of these issues, or funding some of these items. It's really been a lot of fun to see, especially now that it's open. And again, as a division person, this is where we see, and this is where we really find success defined for us. So with that, I will wait probably for some questions at the very end, but that actually ends my portion of the presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Jay. It was really great to see those examples at the end there, especially from Indianapolis. So thank you for that. We are going to, before we move on to our next presenters, I just want to remind everyone that you can type in any questions that you have into the question and answer box on your GoToWebinar control panel. So go ahead and type those in at any time you like, questions for Jay or the next two presenters when they come up. Before we go to the next panelists, I'm going to ask one more poll question. The next presentation will be centered around the ILAS guide, which is a guiding document for from Illinois. And I know we have a pretty diverse audience here, so our presenters would like to see how many people have heard of or used the ILAS guide in the past. So the poll should be up. Go ahead and put in your answer there. It looks like we have about half of the audience that voted. Give it just a few more minutes here. Okay. All right, so here's our results. So it looks like most of the audience have not heard of or used the ILAS guide before, so it should be a great opportunity to share that document. Great, thank you everyone for voting in the poll. Just do a quick introduction here. Our first panelist is Mr. Rick Wanner. He is a landscape architect with the Illinois Department of Transportation Region 1. Rick is a certified landscape architect. He got his Bachelor of Landscape Architecture from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He got his Supervisory and Administrative Management Certificate from William Rainey Harper College. He has been with the IDOT Region 1 Bureau of Maintenance and Roadside Development for 26 years. Has received awards from the Chicago Gateway Green and recognition for developing and teaching the IDOT context-sensitive solutions approach, which I know at least some of our audience members have used in the past. And Rick serves on a number of committees that you can see here on the bottom, but the most relevant probably to this presentation would be his membership to the ILAS committee. So that's Mr. Rick Warner. We will also have a second panelist on this presentation, and that's Ms. Linda Huff. She has been the president of Huff & Huff Engineering for over 32 years. She has over 40 years of work covering many aspects of environmental analysis. She's a pre-qualified EA and EIS lead for transportation projects and has been an active member of the ILAS committee for over 5 years. Again, she's a registered professional engineer. Her chemical engineering degree is from the Purdue University, and she has an MBA from the University of Chicago. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand over the controls to Linda and Rick. And again, while they're getting their controls all set up on GoToWebinar, just a reminder to ask your questions in the question and answer box. We will have some time at the end where all three of our panelists can discuss your questions and provide answers for you.
Are we there, Dan?
Yep, you guys are all set, looks like.
All right.
Okay. Well, I'm Rick Warner. As Dan mentioned, I'm from Region 1 of the Illinois Department of Transportation. And we're talking today about our document we've worked on called ILAS. And there's that word livable again. So it's an acronym for Illinois Livable and Sustainable Transportation Rating System and Guide. And this is a guide similar to what LEED would be for buildings, but designed for transportation systems. And with a few different goals in mind than LEED would be. We don't sell our roads usually after we finish them, so we don't necessarily put a lot of emphasis on the score, but more emphasis on the process of analysis of sustainability and livability of projects as they're developed, built, and operated then. So it's similar to LEED, but in some ways very different. So, and one of the unique aspects of this project was that it wasn't a top-down approach from our agency. It was really a collaborative effort of three groups, the Illinois Department of Transportation, primarily Region 1, which is northeastern Illinois, and ACEC, the American Council of Engineering Companies of Illinois, who Linda is a member of. And then the construction portion of the document was a project where the Illinois Road and Transportation Builders Association was heavily involved and continues to be. So what is this document for? Well, it's mainly and primarily a guide to sustainable practices and a real hands-on type of thing. We didn't want something that you scored at the end and then that was it. We wanted something that you started from the beginning utilizing it so that the goal was to produce really good projects more than to produce really good scores. So that's a maybe different approach than some other systems. And so the simplicity of use was a really key component of or criteria for development of the system. And what I think is valuable in this document is that it's a really good tool for a design team to use, or if you're talking about development of a project through our context-sensitive solutions policy, you can use this document with a technical advisory group. Linda's currently working on a project in Central Illinois where she's utilizing this, the ILAS document with a group to evaluate alternatives and identify ways that the project can be as livable and sustainable as possible. And one of the aspects of the scoring is to identify trade-offs for, say, the human versus the natural. An example would be if you put in a bike path into the project, well, you're going to have more impermeable surface, so you're not going to do so well on stormwater. So by scoring and looking at these things as you go, you can identify those trade-offs and make sure everybody's aware of those and on board with those as you work through the planning process. And then ultimately, if there's a way to have your bike path and good stormwater, then you really get a lot of points. But so innovation is sort of encouraged as well in the process. And then finally, the last real thing that we wanted to do is that everything in ILAST either is currently being done on IDOT projects or could be done on IDOT projects. So these aren't things that someday in the future we'll figure out how to do them. These are all things that either are being done or could be done. And the team felt that there were so many things happening already that were positive that really the word about those sorts of things getting out wasn't happening. So part of the goal of ILAST is to make everyone a little bit more aware of the sustainable practices going on in the transportation industry currently. We finished a project recently in Chicago reconstructing the Dan Ryan Expressway, one of our highest traffic volume expressways, and nothing was trucked off the site. The pavement was reutilized, crushed for subbase, which saved an enormous amount of trucking and cost. One of the things that I think is also useful to look at is that a lot of the things that make it livable and sustainable also come at cost savings rather over time, especially rather than adding cost to the project. So the document is geared toward really a pretty wide audience, the public in general, legislators, engineers. So it's written to be very succinct and accessible, and we certainly encourage everyone to take a look at it if you haven't already, and give us feedback. And when we started this process, there were really no guides on sustainability for roadways like there is for buildings with LEED. So it's sort of unique in that way. And the team felt like this was a real opportunity to be proactive. So rather than waiting for requirements to come down from above, we thought we would work on figuring out what we thought would really work well in the projects that we are all working on and put those together. So the first task of the committee was to figure out, well, what exactly is sustainability? And it was decided to use the United Nations definition, which is meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So that sort of gets to that human-natural balance that Jay talked about earlier. And sustainable highways, we identified really three principal ideas. And one is, of course, that natural, protect, maintain, and preserve natural resources. The second would be to design to enable and encourage lower impact forms of transportation. Often transportation professionals have been very concerned about the experience of drivers of vehicular traffic, and maybe somewhat less concerned of the experience of someone taking a bus or walking or riding a bicycle. So really we wanted this to encourage a more holistic look at transportation. And then use construction practices that reduce environmental and community impact. So not just in the planning and design or operations, but we also wanted to look at construction practices and make sure that the principles were being followed in that phase of the project as well. And so research-wise, the committee looked at some other systems that have been underway. New York State has developed green lights, which really emphasizes the environmental aspects of roadway design. University of Washington has a very comprehensive system called Green Roads. And then the Federal Highway Administration now has come out with a Sustainable Highways self-evaluation tool called INVEST. And being in maintenance, I'm very interested in INVEST because it does also go into operations where ILAS currently doesn't. One of the things, I know this is the Chicago Wilderness Initiative, we've also been very active in NIP, the Northeastern Illinois Invasive Plant Partnership. And the way we operate and maintain roadways is very important, of course, to whether the sustainability goals of these projects really are realized in the end. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Linda.
Okay, thanks, Rick. I'm going to talk a little bit more about ILAST and then what it actually consists of in terms of the manual. And one of the things that was important is that we really wanted to make this a project-based system so that it would provide focus on some issues. It would allow you to develop a score because everyone likes to have a number, but it really is to serve also as a resource manual to project teams. So wherever you are in a project, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, planning, design, or operation, that there were ideas in here that could be helpful. And so it definitely was a bottom-up approach for us. And I think that, we've talked about the goals and really this increasing the use of sustainable features. In order to achieve that, you actually have to know what's possible. What are the sustainable features that could be included? And so it was really a guide to make people think more about what is out there and provide useful information and resources so it really become like a handbook on sustainability. And then the idea would be that we would get feedback from two things. One is, measuring the success of the use of it and the scores to see how could it be improved. So to us, this is not a static document, but really a dynamic document that as we learn, we can go along, we can make it better. And again, the things that Rick alluded to is that we wanted something that would be applicable to all projects, small to large, resurfacing all the way to brand new highways. So it would encompass simple to complex. And again, as I mentioned, it would include all phases. So it is a much more comprehensive document in that sense. And as a result of that, we give information then to all of the users. So there are actually 9 segments, 9 general area categories that we've developed, over 150 sustainable items. And the reason that we feel we could come up with so many is that we had a very diverse committee. It included people in the transportation sector, engineers, scientists, IDOT staff like Rick with landscape architecture, materials, and so it was lighting, trying to be as comprehensive as possible. So it's divided into 9 major categories, and the planning is one of the first ones. So we looked at context-sensitive solutions, which was engaging stakeholders early in the planning process, as well as looking at land use and community needs and community context. So definitely this portion is very compatible with livability ideas. Design, of course, would be important because it really goes to where do you put the alignment, what can you avoid, what kind of cross-section, how can you narrow it. And again, there are always going to be trade-offs, but it was to help people understand what those trade-offs might be. And so we had 13 items that really related to design elements for sustainability. Additionally, environmental, of course, would be a large component of that. And as you can see, we have 34 different items that we identified under wildlife and habitat, trees and plant communities, and noise. And one of the things, like trees and plant communities, we're looking at, not only encouraging native plantings, but also minimizing opportunities for invasive species. And noise abatement is something that now you have, it's included, you have the human environment, because oftentimes people are very concerned about the noise in their community. Additionally, water. Water is something that we all are, are very interested in. And if you look at the number of opportunities that we developed under stormwater, again, we had about 34 different types of practices. And it includes, again, some design measures, some construction practices, and then different types of stormwater treatment. How do we minimize it? So bioswales and all the different things that you hear about are included in there as different ideas. Then transportation itself is important, and again, this would vary significantly depending on the type of project that you had. So transit, for example, which could relate to bus and rail, but also you could see bicycle and pedestrian was very important. We had 13 different items we identified under sustainable practices for transportation, the transportation sector. And in addition, lighting is something that also is important, not only from an energy consumption perspective, but also lighting can have effects on wildlife. And so stray light reduction is important for wildlife as well as in communities. And we wanted to recognize that element as well. The materials is probably one of the more significant ones. One of the practices that's been going on for a long time with the Department of Transportation. As Rick alluded to the Dan Ryan situation, trying to reuse materials is very important, and also looking at new materials. So there are 31 items that are included under material specifications that provides opportunities. So that would also be your recycled asphalt pavement, as well as topsoil and how you salvage that, soil stabilization, a lot of different elements included in that. And always innovation, because there are always going to be new ways to do things and new ideas, and we want to encourage people to do that in any of the categories that we've identified. And then construction is our 9th area. It's our newest one that was recently added, and it includes items that are beyond IDOT specifications. So it really goes to the heart of the construction industry themselves. And the Illinois Road and Transportation Builders were very instrumental in looking at their own practices in terms of wildlife habitat, plant communities, energy, stormwater, and material management in their own operations. So there are 44 items, which are new items that have been added. So really that 150, it's really 150 plus 44 today, because we've added construction practices. And what I wanted to explain a little bit is this ILAS manual is actually divided into 3 parts. The first here that's called a checklist is really kind of like a scorecard. It's a summary that's at the very beginning of the manual. And it basically takes all 9 areas and all basically 150 plus 44 items, features that we identified, and allows those to be scored. So it's almost like your summary. And then there's the main body of the manual where we talk about and explain what all of these things are and what the intent was. And then the third part is the references. So, for example, this is the checklist, which is part of what I've used with some of my stakeholder groups, because it's easy for people to look at them and identify the things in the planning process that they think are important, that we can then really have a dialogue in terms of how would this fit a particular project, and does it make sense for project that we're working on, but it at least allows them to have that knowledge base of thinking about what could be sustainable for my particular project. Then within the document, there's always a section that talks about the intent. What were we trying to do? This is land use and community planning. And then the rationale for that. Why did we think this was important? What would it accomplish? So it would really provide a setting or a background for a person using it to know what the context is of that particular category. And then also included then would be a description of why are the points awarded and what are they awarded for. So there will be a description of a particular element here, like P-2B, accommodate multimodal transportation. So, you know, projects that are applying walkable communities and complete streets, we want to recognize those and encourage people to do that. So that's part of what this manual is about also. And then we provided sources of materials that people could go to. So either engineers or anyone who was using this manual could look up some documents that would help them to understand where our particular concepts came from. So there is a scoring, and that's what the checklist is, but I think it's really important to know that the scoring was not the most important part for us, but it was the most difficult because of the wide range of projects that we're talking about and the wide areas. So it's really to us more of an educational tool. And what we try to do is make it simple, so it would be something that you could self-score. It would be easy for you to do that, and without a lot of calculations and explanations. So our philosophy was really that if it was something that was required, you would get 1 point. If you had a design that went beyond requirements, that would be 2 points. And then if it was a unique, innovative, or special, it would be 3 points. So an example would be wetlands. If you were meeting the mitigation ratios that are set up by the Corps of Engineers, you would get a point. But if you had some additional areas that, through the project that you felt needed to be protected, that could be 2 points. And for example, something unique that might be 3 would be, let's say you have a fen and you have a recharge area, and so you work with the community to set up maybe zoning or some ordinance that would protect the whole recharge area of a fen. That could be a very unique and special one, and you would be getting 3 points for that. And just to, you know, there are no prerequisites for this. Again, we said it wanted to be applicable to all projects, and that it would be all phases. So in looking at this, we had 233 points for 153 items. Now, these projects are going to be very different. So a very sustainable small project might not score as many points as, say, a large project. So we looked at using a percentage of the total applicable items when we were looking at that. So that would really be a scoring process that would say we would determine how many points were applicable to a project at the start of it, and then how many were actually planned in or constructed, and you would get a percentage. So just to show you an example of how that would work, you would see that, again, this is the same part we looked at there. You can see this, there's a certain available points for a project that you would look at that, and there would be 19 maximum points. Then if we were to say, well, what's applicable to our project, we can look at the, for a particular project, some would be not applicable and others would be. And so that would give us and say that we had 12 applicable points for our particular project. Then the question would be, how many did we actually get constructed? And in this case, 8 out of 12, or 67% of the potential points were achieved. And IDOT has been scoring projects as well as they have, you know, as we put this into place, we're kind of catching up in a way. And again, it is something that we thought a project manager should be able to do in just a few hours, something that the public would understand also. And as we gather the data from these different projects, and we probably have over 20 projects that have been scored now, is to look at and see, does it make sense to, how far do we want to take the scoring system? But truly, as I said, it was really, the idea was that we would continue to develop this. As we said, we've just gotten the construction section completed. And really our challenge will be to develop a scoring curve and look at the points that we're awarding and see if there's a better, more information that we can provide to give people guidance. And so really the new version has just come out in February 2012 and is posted on the ACEC website. But I thought what might be more interesting, I know this is kind of abstractual in a way, but Rick is actually going to talk about one of the case studies that, just so you could see how that's really been implemented specifically.
Okay. Well, the project we decided to talk about today is currently under construction. It's a $60 million interchange reconstruction of I-55 at Arsenal Road in Will County, which is southwest of Chicago. And it's a unique landscape because it's very valuable in as far as the natural features. It's also valuable because it's a very industrial location, and as well as a hub for multimodal transportation of goods. So it's a major hub where goods come in or leave on barges, trains, or trucks, and so it's a unique and important landscape in both as far as the natural and human importance. So, which makes it a challenge, and so some of the things that we've done on the project. Probably the largest requirement was, what do we do with stormwater, and how do we protect the important aquatic resources that are downstream in the Medowin and Des Plaines River Wildlife Refuge. And so the slide on the left here is a photograph of a double ditching system where the ditch to the far left takes water from adjacent wetlands, and that water is taken right to the outfall of the interchange. And then the water in the upper ditch to the right-hand side of that photograph is from the roadway, and that water is directed to the wet detention facilities and vegetated swales throughout the project to be treated before it goes to the outfalls of the project. And we are another interesting aspect of this landscape is that the bedrock in this area is very shallow, which a little bit hampered our ability to build stormwater BMPs, but we were able to do that. And one of the challenges during construction is once you take the soil off of the bedrock, how do you get it to stick back to the bedrock when you're putting it back together again? And then the soil, when it was in place and vegetated, the very fine clay particles were stable, but after we stirred them up, then they weren't. So we have done a lot of things here using straw mulch as temporary stabilization. Some other practices, ditch checks and sediment basins. And then the slide up on the upper right, one of the first things that we did in the project is to make a stable outfall to the creek, Grant Creek, which is a high-quality stream in the area, so that the water running from the project to the creek flowed in a stable area. And to help, even with these more traditional construction site BMPs, we still had what we thought was not quite acceptable water quality because of those very fine clay particles. So we used polymers to bind those particles together. That's the slide of the flock logs in the lower right. And then we've also found that we found it very useful to beef up the cover with compost instead of just straw, because the compost provided an additional way to break the impact of the raindrops and suspending those clay particles. So we had originally intended to modify the soil in the end with the compost, but found it very useful to use during construction as well. And so where do we see ILAST going? As I mentioned earlier, I think the biggest value of it versus some of the other rating system is that it really can be utilized today and is being utilized today. It isn't things that are theoretical. And it's consistent with all IDOT, Federal Highway policies and procedures. So if you're a designer, you can go to it and know that you won't be running down a dead-end street that isn't going to actually work out in your project in the end. So I think that's really valuable. And probably even as these other systems are more developed, like INVEST, we will probably still need a document like ILAST to kind of make that link between these very theoretical approaches and what you can actually do on the projects that you're working on. And here's a link if you haven't gotten there already. ILAST document can be found on the ACEC Illinois website under other links. So there are a number of links on the website, and you want to go all the way to the bottom to find it. It's under other links. Okay, back to Dan.
Great, thank you very much, Linda and Rick. That was fantastic. We got a few questions, so I'm going to go ahead and transition over to show you the questions.
Okay. I could probably see.
All right. Okay. So this question looks like it's for Jay. Do you have an example of a project red flagged by a metropolitan planning organization? What do you expect to happen once that project is red flagged?
As a matter of fact, we do. It is not uncommon, especially with projects that have been historically laying around for a long time, for MPOs in particular to try to red flag a state project, for example. I know up in Valparaiso there was a state road, I want to say 149 project that was flagged by the MPO. Now, we at the time didn't call it red flagging, but it's an example of the kind of activity that would occur. At that point, what would happen is that the MPO and the project sponsor, or in this case the state, got together and talked about, well, what were the concerns and what were the considerations? And what was developed then was an alternative or an accommodation or design changes to help make sure that the project was not red flagged, in essence. In many cases, it may be where it is not a requirement, but a desire for local communities to have certain elements to be added. I know in some cases, MPOs and the state have actually collaborated to make sure that if, for example, a certain surface treatment is requested, or if certain features are desired, in Indiana, metropolitan planning organizations in the state have actually worked together to help fund certain improvements as well. So red flagging isn't intended to prevent projects. It, I guess, could, in fact, be able to do that. However, that would then be justified by the analysis that was prepared. And because the procedures or the process that is used to develop a red flag is done with the state, it's not really a surprise if something does get red flagged.
Great.
I hope that
Thank you,
answers
Jay.
that question.
All right. Our next question. How can the general public help design and implement specific bus routes? I would imagine this is for any of our three panelists.
Well, I would say that in the context-sensitive solution process, which is really oftentimes when you're looking at different modes of transportation, and in fact, it's several of the projects I'm working on now in the phase 1. That's where you ask for the input from people in terms of what is important to them. You look at those. So I think certainly in the phase 1 process, when there's a study going on, that's very pertinent.
Right. I think the project that we're working on currently, where we've gotten a lot of input from the public, is the Elgin O'Hare West Extension, and that's wound up being a very important component of the planning of that project through citizen involvement and asking for those things to be included in the project.
So oftentimes there's an initial public meeting when a project is starting. And depending on whether, like, context-sensitive solution isn't followed for all projects, but there's always public involvement. And so really it's critical that you participate whenever, the first notice of a meeting comes out, which is usually in the community, because that's when you get your name on a list. That's when you start getting the information and you actually have a chance to make an input.
Right. Yeah, from a federal perspective, there are 3 places where I could see you being plugged in. Transit is typically run by the transit operators themselves, so it may be something that they need to actually be given that specific feedback. It may not be that there's a project underway. It may be just that you need new bus service. That would be one option. In the Chicago and Northwest Indiana area, I would also point out that there is a federal requirement for what's called a congestion management process. The congestion management process, or CMP, as is sometimes used as an acronym, is intended to identify those areas of a metropolitan area that are most congested. And to get back to that performance measure that I'm always looking for, this is a place where I would love to see what is the current and existing level of service for transit, so that the public would be able to know, okay, these are the various routes, this is where we see ridership coming from and needing to go to. And in that way, it informs the metropolitan planning organizations as to what the current situation is for transit. And that way, they also have the ability then to take any of their dedicated funding and apply them to either expanding transit service or talking about what are some ways we might want to balance some of our investments so that we can provide either what's listed here as a new bus service or to change an existing route. So there's a couple other places even before a project is identified that the audience may want to plug into.
Great. Thank you, everyone. All right, next question. Some kudos for having put together the ILAS guide. Now, how would our audience members influence the use of the ILAS method to engineers and planning groups?
Well, I would say bring it up in your public comment, and it's certainly meant to be utilized by the public as much as by our staff or planning team to kind of, it's really meant to create that dialogue. So if you don't think it's currently being utilized on a project and you think it should be, I would certainly bring that up. I think that's appropriate.
And as I said, what we've tried to do is now in these smaller groups, when we're working with a stakeholder group, is to actually use that right at the beginning of a project before the design has actually even started, and just say, here's a list of all types of things that we've identified for sustainability. What makes sense for us to investigate? And I think that we as engineers are asking those questions, but if you were part of that, once you know that this exists, bringing it up and asking those questions will create that opportunity for dialogue, for sure.
Great. We got this question a few times. Will the presentation materials be emailed to the meeting participants? Yes. I will be collecting the final presentations, and we also made a recording of this presentation, and these things will go up on the Delta Institute website for people to access, and I will email out the link to that once it is ready. So these materials will be available in the next couple of days. This is a question, looks like it's posed to everyone. What are some valuable interagency collaboration best practices you've identified through your work?
Well, I think we do a lot of that through context-sensitive solutions, and that's one of the challenges. Is to we have to often work with federal agencies. We like to say we make the decisions about our transportation projects, but there are many decision makers, and that's one of the things that the public isn't always aware of. But we have rules we have to follow: federal highway rules, EPA rules, Corps of Engineers rules. So we've had the Corps of Engineers and the EPA actually attending our training courses on context-sensitive solutions, so that they're present and at the early stages of development of projects. And I think that's really helping a lot, so that we don't get through a lot of preliminary engineering before we really know where we're headed.
Well, and there's also the NEPA 404 merger process in Illinois, where all the agencies, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, U.S. EPA, Corps of Engineers, state agencies, including the Department of Natural Resources, Department of Agriculture, they meet 3 times a year, and projects are brought to them to discuss the purpose and need or the alternatives, and you get formal approval from them. And oftentimes, we do field trips with them while we are in the planning process between the purpose and need and the alternatives, because I think it's important for them to go out and actually see what these sites look like, because then you get a better understanding. They have a better understanding of the challenges, and we found that extremely valuable is to take a field trip with the agencies.
Right. And to participate in these kind of committee endeavors with the agencies. I'm tomorrow going to an Illinois Urban Manual Committee meeting where the Corps of Engineers and the IEPA will be there, so that as policies are being developed that we're all going to try to follow, then we've all had a say in how those were put together and are comfortable with those.
Yeah, this is Jay, and I guess I would agree that having the opportunity for having your other partners to get involved and work with you is very important. I know all of our environmental procedures that we have with the state have been vetted with the federal resource agencies as well. The one other thing that I was told really made our Super Bowl experience successful was a clear sense of what the end result was and a timeline. The Super Bowl was going to happen, and it really pushed everybody to make sure that we were timely in making decisions. And I don't know how you recreate that, but I would tell you that at the end, everybody had such a celebratory type attitude, because we could see an amazing event being pulled off, that I think when we're doing our more traditional projects, we don't always get to see that. But it was certainly a way for all of the agencies that had to work together, not just the government agencies, the MPOs and the city and the Federal Highway Administration, but the private sector, the utility companies that had to make sure that their utilities were out of the way so that that trail project along Georgia Street could be done. Got it done. Was really an amazing part that made it successful. So I think that being able to participate in events such as that really helps to build a lot of camaraderie, and we're reaping the benefits of that now, especially in the Indianapolis area.
Right. I think the inverse of that is projects that take 10 years to plan and trying to maintain that energy through the whole period. and get everyone to the table early enough. A lot of times we don't get meaningful feedback until we're ready to put the job out for bid, and that's really not the right time to get that meaningful feedback. It doesn't work well. So I think one of the challenges is to get environmental organizations and agencies to the table early enough in the project, so that their input can really be valuable.
Great. Well, we're bumping right up against 11:30 here, which is our end time. If the panelists don't mind, maybe we can stick around for a few minutes. There are a few more questions. But I just wanted to do a really quick wrap-up for the folks who might have to run right at 11:30. So just real quick, thank you everyone for attending, and thank you to our panelists for the great presentations and great Q&A session. If you have any questions or comments after the presentation, please feel free to send me an email or give me a phone call. My contact info is there. And also, for your calendars, save the date for the next webinars in this series. On May 16th, we will be doing a preview of the Green Infrastructure Vision 2.0. On June 20th, we will have a local project showcase with presentations by our local partners on this project from McHenry County and Northwest Indiana. And the date is still to be decided on this, but we will also be having a federal transportation perspectives and tools presentation in the near future. So again, thank you to everyone, and I think if our panelists are okay with it, we might stick around for a few more minutes just to answer a couple more questions here. And as I said earlier, we will be emailing out a link to the presentations, contact info, and recording of this webinar in case you have any colleagues who may have missed the presentation but wanted to attend. So without further ado, we'll get back to the questions. So thanks for pausing there to the panel. Let's see. So it looks like this is the next question here. As I participate in the various stages of projects, is this group available to discuss possible strategies and decide on focus to get livability principles into road building and rehab? So are the panelists available to help consult or give any advice on those issues?
Well, I think all of our projects are in Region 1. If you're in my district, so certainly, and if it's an IDOT project. But they're all being scored through ILAST, all of our projects in planning and design. So,
and it might be something to take to the overall committee.
Right.
Or we are still meeting our ACE committee, and if there are particular things that people are interested in, that might really be good for us to talk about as a group.
Mm-hmm.
Because we do have that diversity too that might help with strategies.
Right. And one of the things that we're not quite sure about yet is one of the reasons it's very simple is that things like LEED cost a lot of money and take a lot of time to evaluate projects. And we don't want that. We want, because we don't have that motive like a developer would to have a LEED stamp to sell our new houses. We're not selling houses. We're not developers. So, so if other groups would like to, I would think there are groups that would want to give awards to projects or participants in who score well in that, and really encourage that.
And we've given presentations to a lot of different groups to try to raise that awareness, and I think that's part of the issue is getting the awareness.
From the Indiana point of view, I would say this is a good example of bringing up that really the design standards are going to be, at least in Indiana, primarily state developed. And we do not have in Indiana something like ILAST. However, I will tell you we will borrow iLast and probably be talking with them about how to incorporate some of these things, because what we have found, and you just used the idea that we probably will try, and that is we'd like to recognize those that have high-scoring projects. We have our, in Indiana we call it Road School. I can't remember how they do it in Illinois, but it's an opportunity for all communities to get together, and there are awards or recognition given to different projects for different aspects. I believe that using the iLast type approach, it would be worthwhile for us to recognize those projects that seem to be scoring the highest, and even at different stages, so that you get a sense of what does a high-scoring project look like in construction, what does one look like that's high-scoring in development, things like that. But in Indiana, all of the state state design standards are going to be maintained through the Indiana DOT and its districts. So that's a difference between the two states.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I think we'll do just one more question and then sign off. So given the uncertainty of future transportation funding, what are some low and no-cost ways communities and or professionals can promote livability?
Well, being in operations, sometimes you have to. I know in the you can't. Not all context-sensitive solutions are construction projects. I know in the city of Chicago, they're adding bike lanes without reconstructing streets and doing a lot of things. So if there are transportation and livability issues, it's worth having a discussion about those, even though, and that's sort of the point of context-sensitive solutions, is to identify problems before you identify projects. And the solution that comes out of the process may not be a project. So it may be simply restriping the street, or maybe planting a few trees, or changing signage, or things that are really not construction projects, but more operations type issues.
I would agree with Rick. I'd also add that when you say the uncertainty of funding is out there, well, I think we spoke to federal funding, but there may be other resources out there. And I think that the Donnelly Foundation is an example of a foundation that can help contribute in a variety of ways. Maybe it's not always construction, but I like the way Rick also mentioned earlier that sometimes the solution isn't a project, but it's how do you describe your need? How do you describe that concern that's out there? Because it may not be a highway capacity problem. It may be a need for transit service. It may need to be a need to just rehabilitate the existing sidewalks that are there. I think from our experience here in Indiana, that's really where we've tried to start, really making livability mean something to everybody, is that ability to walk from your house to the store or to the library is really important. And it doesn't always cost a lot of money, and in many cases, it's not a federal aid highway project. It may, however, be your local city or town that's going to be replacing that sidewalk. So to try to make livability not just be about the federal aid program or even a state program, it's really a local need.
Right. Great. It just occurs to me, one of the things that really is terrific about having that dialogue is the partnerships that are formed, and where one we have in Chicago is with a group called Chicago Gateway Green, where the business community funds gardens along expressways to encourage tourism in Chicago, where the department really couldn't have afforded to do that, where the business community could, and we provide recognition for that. Or so partnerships that develop by just identifying livability issues and working through it, you can find resources sometimes where they're difficult to find.
Great. Well, thank you for the answers, everyone. And so it's about 11:40, so I think we're going to sign off in respect of everyone's time. But again, please feel free to send an email or give me a phone call, or just wait for the follow-up email if you have any further questions for the presenters or for myself. And again, save the date for those next webinars in the series. So thank you to everyone who's attended, and a big thanks to our great panelists today. And that will conclude the webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.